As we get close to the end of the year, we think of endings and we think of beginnings. The traditional thing is to make New Year's resolutions and promises, and then go and spend money trying to force yourself to do something you know you probably should do, but you just don't want to. Because if you wanted to do it, you would have done it already, and you wouldn't need a resolution in the first place. Funny how it's so often tied in with spending money though, isn't it? That's not an accident. So this video is not about New Year's resolutions or promises or spending money or doing something you don't want to do. This is about when a person becomes new. And what I mean by that is one day you're just going along and being you and doing all the things you ordinarily do, all the work, all the chores, all the obligations, all the mindless pastimes. And then all of a sudden, something happens and you're not you anymore. You become someone new. Does that sound weird to you? It has probably happened to you maybe more than once, but maybe you don't realize. Or maybe you do. But suddenly, you're not who you were anymore. And you'd think that when something like this happens, it should be big. It should be monumental. It should come with bells ringing and horns blaring and a wild parade. It should be a planned, exciting, earth-shattering event. But in reality, it's absolutely none of those things. In fact, it's usually an event that's so small, if you're not paying attention, you might miss it, although you'll still be changed. You just won't know how or why. And I think it's important that we do know how and why, because it gives us a starting point to spring forward. So basically, it's what we call a milestone. And now I'm not talking about events like graduations or weddings or the birth of children. Yes, these are major life-changing events, but they're not the secret milestones that make us instantly stop being one person and start being someone else. The word milestone was first used in the year 1662, and it meant a stone or post on the side of the road that showed the distance to a place, how far you'd come and how much further you'd have to go. And you can imagine how important something like that would have been back in a world that had no cell phones, no GPS, no computers, no pocket maps, no corner stores. Just a post or a stone on the side of the road telling you how far you'd come and where you could head to. So these secret milestones in our lives that are so brief, yet so all-encompassing, they occur and are like a little lamp post that's lit on the side of the road map of our life. And they have a habit of making this strange imprint on your mind, unlike anything else. Let me give you an example. About 35 years or so ago, I was on a camping trip with an old boyfriend. It was a great trip to a wonderful spot on a river. I remember it as if it happened yesterday. Each night, all night long, I could hear the river rushing by as I slept, and I could smell the smoke from the embers of the fire we'd made. We stayed for several nights, and honestly, it was magical. It was so magical that I didn't want to leave. I was already at a crossroads in my life, not sure which direction to go in. I'm sure you're familiar with that feeling. I knew that where I was not where I wanted to be. But beyond that, I didn't know how to even think about the situation, let alone solve it. And that boyfriend was like a cement stone around my neck, pulling me down to drown. But I didn't realize that either. I remember clearly we were getting ready to leave. Everything was packed in the car. The site was checked over to make sure we hadn't left anything. We had already settled our bill, and I was sad because I wanted to stay in the wilderness and not go back to civilization. At the time, I lived in a city, which was slowly siphoning the life out of me. Well, we got into the car and I was driving, and as I pulled away from the site and started slowly down the lane, I saw the most beautiful deer I had ever seen in my life. She leapt across the road and covered it in one leap, and I swear she seemed to fly. Never had I seen such grace, such perfect beauty. I stopped the car and just stared. And I said to my boyfriend that the deer was absolutely matched and perfect for her environment. But we were not. We were interlopers. I felt like some kind of lumbering slow ox who wanted nothing more in the world than to be a part of this deer's environment. But instead I was stuck in my current me. Of course, he looked at me like I was crazy, as he always did. So I watched the deer go, leaping to amazing heights and delighting in her strength, and just being her, just being alive, just being a deer running on a path toward the woods. And all of a sudden, all the angst inside of me, all that feeling of being trapped in a dank city, just erupted right out of my head. I sat there and cried. Tears were just streaming down my face, and I pointed to the deer and said, "She's perfect. That's where I should be." And as I said, I was crying. My boyfriend looked at me, rolled his eyes, and said, "No, just no." And he pointed to the road, which I guess meant I should step on the gas and get moving. No, I asked myself. And then came the milestone, and I remember it just as clear as day. And I said, "Oh yes, yes." And I stopped crying. And suddenly, right there, right then, I wasn't the me I was just a few seconds ago. Something about that beautiful tear had resonated so deep inside me. And suddenly, I was done. I went home. It was a long drive. And I'll bet you can guess that that relationship didn't last much longer. I went back to the place where the former me used to live. I didn't care much for her sense of style or decoration. The shiny baubles that meant something to her seemed very drab to me. Her clothing, her place of employment, well, like I said, I was done. Shortly thereafter, I left that city, never to return. And I had many adventures, some good and some bad after that. But I'll never forget that deer leaping across the path. I'll never forget how she opened a door I didn't even know I had inside me. And so that's what I mean about these old milestones, these markers in our life that show us where we presently are and how far we are from the next place we want to be. So here we are at the end of the year. And while I do believe that milestones can happen at any time on any day, they happen most easily at the natural transition of the year from one place on the timeline to the next. There was an ancient Roman god named Janus, who was said to be the god of gates, passageways, beginnings and endings. He is traditionally shown as having two faces on one head, each face pointing in the opposite direction of the other. That is because one set of eyes is looking at the place from which he has come, and the other set of eyes is looking at the place to which he is headed. He was a god of journeys and gateways. His name stems from a Latin word that means doorway. And really, you can look at his name more as a verb than as a noun, because the word, the name, Janus, implies action, moving from one thing to another. It implies two situations, often very different from one another, and being poised almost in the air between the two. One part of you looks back at the old familiar life, the other part of you looks forward to the new unknown. Janus is the god of the threshold, and this is why a new husband traditionally carries his new wife over the threshold. He brings her from one life to another. This is an old tradition that harks all the way back to Janus. Janus causes action. I often wonder if Janus took the form of the deer who leapt across my path all those years ago. It would make sense. It was a path, a sort of threshold. The deer leapt from one place to another, flying almost like a bird, And I think Janus was communicating with me in the only way I was capable of understanding at the time. It's funny how, when we learn about ancient deities and religions, we hear of brave heroes like Hercules and Thor, of beautiful goddesses of love like Aphrodite and Venus, goddesses of discord and gods of war, and so on and so on. But no one ever seems to mention Janus very much these days. And that's really quite strange, because in the ancient world, he was exceptionally popular and important. Yet today, he is never mentioned at all. It is almost as if he has been purposely erased. If you think about it, he represents time itself. He stands at the gateway of where time begins. He stands at the gateway into heaven. He represents absolute change, going from one condition to another. He can see into the past and look into the future all at the same time. But getting back to our milestones, those secret, small, and yet monumental things that happen in our lives, that move us from being one person to completely being someone else. Those milestones that act as thresholds and usher us into something new, if we have the presence of mind to acknowledge them for what they are. Because they don't come into our lives with bells and horns and whistles. On the contrary, they're very quiet, like a leaping deer, or the sun slanting a certain way through the trees, or the sound of a waterfall that reaches us and touches us in just that certain way, if we're ready and if we're smart enough to remember and do something about it. One thing that I haven't really come across in my studies is this. If you're standing on a threshold, you really aren't in one place or another. You're poised, so to speak. Most likely you will go forward. But it is conceivable that you could go back, too. It is conceivable that you could turn around and head back. Now, if you were heading back into a wonderful life you have, then I would say by all means do so, head back. But if you're heading back into something awful because you're afraid of moving forward, because you're afraid of the unknown, then I would say that this threshold could be both a blessing and a curse. So there's a point to everything I've just told you. Here we are at the end of the year, the time ruled by Janus. Here we are getting ready to stand once again on a threshold. This is a natural threshold created by time, created by the calendar. And we have already talked about thresholds or milestones created by life itself, or perhaps by our higher selves. What if, instead of the same old, boring New Year's resolutions that never go anywhere, what if you do something different? It doesn't involve spending any money, not 1 cent. It doesn't involve the latest thing, whatever that might be. I can't keep track of the garbage anymore, nor have I any desire to do so. It doesn't involve food or drinks, or diets, or exercise, or drugs, or anything the world might have to offer you. Instead, you are to do 2 things. First, think back to the milestones in your life. You have had them. You might remember them vividly, or maybe this is the first time you're ever even thinking about them. Again, I'm not talking about the so-called big things, like graduations or marriages or even childbirth. I'm talking about the tiny things that are like a switch that go off in your mind. The deer that leaps across your path, the sunlight that slants low on an old city street, in a town where you as a child are walking, or the sound of the wind in a terrible storm that changes your perception of life forever. I want you to think about these things and how they felt and what happened to you afterward. Then I want you to stand in a threshold in your house, or maybe between 2 trees in the woods if you want. Anything that's a threshold, as a passage from one place to another. You can bring a candle with you if you'd like, if you want to make it more romantic or mystical. And when you get there, when you get to the threshold, just stand there and think. Just think. Because, you see, I have this theory. If these milestones can happen to us out of nowhere, perhaps we can also make them occur. Perhaps, instead of waiting for a change to come along or even trying to be more perceptive about changes, perhaps instead we can create the magical threshold ourselves and walk across it with purpose. And, of course, this can be done at any time of the year, but the new year beckons now, and what do you have to lose? No, I mean that. What do you have to lose? Give it a shot. Give it a shot. Then wait patiently. Maybe something will happen immediately. Maybe it'll happen when you least expect it, in a few days or a few weeks. But I think it will happen. You will become a creator. You will become a changer. You will become